Vietnam's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Pham Minh is currently paying an official visit to the DPRK, and in about 2 weeks, the second Trump-Kim meeting will take place in Hanoi, the capital city of Vietnam. What are the purposes of this visit? What role is there for Vietnam in US-DPRK relations? And could the DPRK follow Vietnam in becoming a former enemy of the United States that normalizes relations as it seeks a path to greater prosperity? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Teng Jianqun, Director of the Center of Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. We shall also speak via satellite to Richard White, the Director of the Center for Political Military and Analysis at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and Joseph Kim, CGTN correspondent in Seoul. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, Professor Teng. What do you think of the agenda of this Vietnam Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister? Is that in an effort to lay the groundwork for a formal summit between Mr. Kim Jong-un and his Vienna counterpart in Hanoi before the second summit between President Trump and Kim? I mean, it sounds like a tongue twist, but what do you think of the agenda of the current visit?
Actually, this is a very important visit by the Vietnamese Foreign Minister to Pyongyang. Actually, early last December, the Foreign Minister of DPRK, Ron Yung-hao, also paid a visit to Hanoi. I'm sure they touched upon the preparation for the coming summit between the two leaders from DPRK and from the United States. So during the staying in Pyongyang, I'm sure the Foreign Minister of Vietnam will give some detailed explanation on the preparation for the coming summit between the two leaders, especially the logistic support and the security support. So I think this is actually another arrangement for Donald Trump and for Chairman Kim Jong-un, and also the preparation for an official or state visit of Chairman Kim Jong-un to Hanoi. So at least the two assignments for the Foreign Minister's visit to Pyongyang at this moment.
Thank you so much. Let me cross over to Joe, who's standing by in Seoul. Hello, Joe. What will be the deliverables on the agenda of the Vietnam Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister? What will be achieved?
Well, his visit to Pyongyang really marks an important step for something that's been happening for quite some time. We've heard first about the reports that the DPRK might want to adopt an economic system, a political system, such as Vietnam during the first summit between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. That's when reports came out that Kim Jong-un personally told Moon Jae-in that he would want some kind of economic system such as Vietnam. And it puts a position that gives perhaps not only South Korea a better inkling of what the DPRK wants, but also the United States. We know that there are certain comparable aspects of Vietnam's economy to the DPRK. We know that the DPRK wants a one-party top-down system. We know that they have a commitment to improve the economy. And under Kim Jong-un, there's been experimentation on reform. So there's all these factors that make it important that this visit is successful on the DPRK's part, but also for Vietnam, as they can now play another role in these talks between the United States and the DPRK, as well as South Korea.
Joe, what you say actually reminds me of what happened exactly 40 years ago when China was about to emancipate the mind and to liberalize our central planning one way or another. In fact, Mr. Teng, why do we have so many similarities between Vietnam and China? In the early days of China's opening up and reform, we did a lot of things because of the strong leadership of late senior leader Deng Xiaoping. But do you think Vietnam boasted of similar advantages when they were to start the reform in 1986?
Actually, I think there are some similarities if we have a comparison between the open up reform in China and in Vietnam. For example, the international environment for China, was greatly improved. China normalized relations with the United States, with Japan, and with some other Western countries. This is very important for China's domestic reform. And as for Vietnam, after the decades of wars against Cambodia, against China, the leaders in Vietnam suddenly realized reform and open up should be the only way for that country to be a strong and a prosperous state. So I think the international condition, environment for China and Vietnam at that time were almost the same. But the domestic politics, also the decision makers, China has got Deng Xiaoping, the so-called the designer of our open up reform, and Vietnam also has some important decision makers to promote such development. How about DPRK? The DPRK does not have such international environment. So there are some similarities.
I'm a little surprised, Mr. Tang, that despite the border clash that took place in 1979 between Vietnam and China, Hanoi decided to draw inspirations from Beijing in starting its own reform and perhaps a campaign of modernization. Let me go back to, in fact, Richard Wise, our American commentator who's standing by in the D.C. Hello, Richard. We are so appreciative of your participation. It's so early local time in the D.C. Thank you so much for coming to our program. But what do you think of the security concerns of President Trump? Do you think he has actually got rid of Pham fury or the maximum pressure in urging President paramount leader Kim Jong-un to get rid of the nuclear weapons? So what do you think of the possible change of mind on the American side, or nothing changes ever since the first summit in Singapore?
First, thanks for having me. Despite the earliness of the time, the importance of this topic will always get me up, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate. President Trump has, in his formal statements and rhetoric, has been very optimistic, saying that he thinks that he's developed a good relationship with the North Korean leader. They have a commitment to denuclearize, and so this second meeting will just secure some of the details. But the intelligence community recently testified before Congress, and the director of intelligence said that, as far as they're aware, there's no progress in denuclearization. There's no indication of denuclearization. So the administration can rightly claim credit for ending North Korea's nuclear weapons tests and nuclear weapons missile launches, but we haven't seen the kind of a standard, comprehensive, irreversible, verifiable denuclearization that's normally been a key demand of U.S. administrations. So I suppose this summit will give a good indication of what would be the next step. The North Koreans, of course, want relaxation of U.S. sanctions and other concessions. So maybe we'll see some deeper trading. Maybe we'll get more progress in denuclearization in return for commitments, more concrete commitments to remove the U.S. sanctions.
Well, despite the temporary lifting of the part and partial shutdown of the federal government over the issue of building a wall, President Trump, do you think this is a matter of domestic politics for President Trump to go ahead with a meeting with his North Korean counterpart? To what degree do you think he's hopeful that something will be achieved anyway through the second summit in Hanoi? Richard?
Well, he's has very great confidence in his negotiating skill. I wouldn't say this is so much domestic politics. I mean, it's perhaps the president's thinking of his place in history. Certainly he'd like to get a Nobel Prize, or at least be remembered as someone who brought peace to Korea. And in his State of the Union speech, he said that if it wasn't for him, we might be at war by now. So I think it might redound to his benefit domestically, although normally not very much. Domestic factors are normally decided by the economy and other things. I think really he's thinking about how he can end one of these major threats to world peace, and he'll gain personally, but I think we would all benefit if he succeeds.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Joe. Hi, Joe. There's a popular joke in the circle of academics here in Beijing that in Europe we have the Brexit, but in Asia, East Asia, we have a similar thing. South Korea increasingly defined and wants to leave the American leadership, and they want to take the initiative in remarkably improving the situation in the divided Korean Peninsula. Is that true, that President Moon Jae-in is very ambitious? He wants to take the helmsman back into his own hands, and he wants to shape his own very independent policy towards the inter-Korean relationship.
Well, that could be the opinion of some experts, but from the words of the administration here in South Korea, whether it's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa or the President himself, we've heard them reaffirm their commitment to the United States alliance between Seoul and Washington. Now, we heard that Seoul wants to play the role of mediator, that it wants to be the negotiator between the two, that it wants to help facilitate the conversation between the DPRK and the United States. So in terms of Moon Jae-in trying to take the lead, we don't know if that is possibly the case, but we do know that South Korea is trying to facilitate more inter-Korean projects in order to try to help what they say is denuclearization. Now, some of this has come into the conflict of ties between Washington and Seoul, as some have argued that it goes against sanctions. But if we just look at the numbers over the past year, we see that inter-Korean projects approval from South Korea has increased by many-fold. We saw that in 2017, 193 projects were granted by the South Korean government, and the jump went to 707 last year. So we do see a great jump after the thaw between the DPRK and South Korea.
Well, there are obviously a lot of topics to address. Let me go back to Mr. Tang for the agenda in Hanoi. How likely is it that a kind of a ceasefire, not a ceasefire, peace agreement could be inked between the United States and the DPRK, so that the process of rapprochement will really be embarked upon?
I don't think Donald Trump can get such green light to have agreement or treaty with DPRK at this moment, because the control of the representatives of the House in the Capitol Hill in the hand of Democratic Party. And if any treaty to be reached, that should get the permission from the Capitol Hill. At this moment, I don't think the congressman will give such permission. But Donald Trump can do something. For example, the continuation of the suspension of large-scale military drills in Korean Peninsula, and also the withdrawal of some troops from ROK. In terms of DPRK, I'm sure Kim Jong-un will continue his promise to suspend the test of missile and nuclear facilities. So I think they can do something. They can get some deal, but not a treaty or agreement between the two sides.
Let's look at the Chinese influence, if any. Despite the freeze in nuclear and missile testing since 2017, and also the moribund process of six-party talks, in which China played, of course, a pivotal role. All these things brushed aside, what do you think of the impact of the current foreign ministers meeting between Russia and China in Moscow? At the same time, Vice Premier and the Foreign Minister of Vietnam is paying a visit to the DPRK. Obviously, something is going on quietly. Don't forget that China and Russia, or the former Soviet Union, were the two major parties in the Korean War that broke out in 1950, in the wake of the Second World War. So, what do you think of the joint efforts and huge influence that China and Russia could exercise in shaping the future of the Korean Peninsula?
I think China and Russia can play a very important role in shaping the future of the Korean Peninsula for its peace and stability. Let's discuss this issue from two aspects. At United Nations, as a permanent member of UN Security Council, at some time China and Russia gave very good position to the peace and stability in Korean Peninsula. For example, China's policy toward DPRK, actually three principles: no nuclear in that country, no war, and they should have a good way to find a peaceful solution to solve this issue. So this is actually good policy for the regional countries. And why DPRK survived so many times in the history after the Korean War since 1950s. And we paid a visit to Pyongyang last September. They proudly said during these years, the DPRK has won all the games played with the United States. Why? Because DPRK got support from two big brothers, that is to say China and Russia, gave 100% support to maintain the peace and stability in this region. And for the United States, this is actually a leverage to deploy its troops here, to be a dominant player in the geopolitical competition in Northeast Asia. So I think this is not a nuclear issue itself. It's actually a competition among major powers.
Let me go back to Joe and Richard. Hi. A war game has been scheduled between Washington and Seoul to conduct the military exercises as an annual war game. Now, obviously, the frosty mistrust needs to be minimized between Washington and DPRK since the truce that was signed in Panmunjom in 1953. So, do you think a peace agreement will be the first major step in the correct direction to start the process of confidence building, so that they could have the luxury of really starting the process of denuclearization? Richard, first of all, your reply.
Sure. This question of sequencing is proving a challenge for everybody. So, as a colleague pointed out in the studio, the Russian-Chinese plan has been a three-step process in which first you have suspension of the major exercises between the United States and South Korea, and you have a suspension of the nuclear and missile tests by North Korea. And that's occurred, surprisingly. And then the second step has been these bilateral summits, with the President of North Korea meeting President of the U.S. and others. And then the next step is the real challenge, which is to go back to the multilateral format and bring about a comprehensive peace settlement that includes denuclearization, integration of North Korea into the world economy, and so on. So the challenge has been that the fear in Washington is that if you suspend the exercises, agree to a peace agreement, remove the sanctions too early, you're not going to get the denuclearization. So the U.S. would like to see denuclearization first, and then all these other concessions come later. And the North Koreans, of course, want the opposite sequence. So we're still struggling with that. So yes, the exercises have been scheduled, but I would not be surprised if they're postponed. Yes, there's discussions of a peace treaty, but there's got to be probably some more progress towards denuclearization before the U.S. and Japan, South Korea at least, would be willing to sign a peace treaty.
Joe, what do you think of the tricky issue of a chicken and egg? Which come first to, fix the problem of trust between the two sides, Washington and Pyongyang?
Well, this has been really the issue and why talks have been stalled since the first summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. We heard during that summit that there was negotiations in terms of suspending the military drills, but now we are seeing slowly but surely that joint drills between South Korea and the United States are starting again. We've also seen that not only is the DPRK criticizing the United States for perhaps creating tension in the region, but we're also seeing criticism from the DPRK state media against South Korea, which becomes a very big problem, as I mentioned, because South Korean President Moon Jae-in has tried to play facilitator in this role. But something that even South Koreans are worried about is the topic of readiness. Even if we look at the guard posts that both South Korea and the DPRK agreed to destroy, many have suggested that it is unfair because North Korea has about 160, whereas South Korea only had 60 itself. So destroying 10 guard posts actually puts South Korea in more of a vulnerable position. So we can see that there's still many sides to this problem, and from the DPRK perspective, they want security guarantee before they can move forward, whereas the United States wants more commitment on denuclearization.
Thank you so much, Joe and Richard. Mr. Tang, what do you think of the chance that Russia and China could join hands in providing the DPRK with security assurance, so that we'll go back to somehow the heyday of the Northern Triangle during the during the Korean War?
I just proposed to my boss that we should have a community, something like ASEAN. You know, from the very beginning, we can touch upon some insensitive issues. For example, the exploration of war remains in the DMZ, and also some other, items of cooperation that not on the list of UN Security Council sanction. So this is an attempt to give some area to show their cooperation. And then I think Russia and China and the United States can sit down together to share their good concern. And of course, different countries, the major powers have their own interest in this region, for the dominance or for the peace and stability. The peace and stability actually in Korean Peninsula is a good condition for China's domestic development. Just imagine if there was war, China will stop its development at home. So I think peace and stability in this region is #1 job for China and for Russia, but as for the United States, especially for the congressmen in the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., they might think they should have some bargaining chip or leverage in this region to deploy its troops to control the two allies in Northeast Asia.
Americans do have their resources and assets to leverage. For example, the forward military presence of up to 70,000 in Northeast Asia. Having said this, let me go back to Richard. What do you think of the possibility that our President, Mr. Xi Jinping, is likely to visit the DPRK? That's pretty important, since this year witnesses the 70th anniversary of the bilateral relationship between the DPRK and China. So there are many reasons for the heads of state of the PRC to pay a visit to Pyongyang. In that case, do you think China will quickly resume its enormous influence over the DPRK?
Well, as what's interesting is so far it's been a bit of an anomaly. In the past, one of the first countries that would come to Pyongyang would be the President of the People's Republic of China. President Xi has been unusual in having not gone there, and in fact he went to Seoul first. Now, we know that this was because there were some challenges initially in the relationship. Kim Jong-un I would argue, pursued an anti-China policy, at least the first few years, being unfriendly to China, critical of China, and so on, perhaps as he was consolidating his power at home. The last year has seen improvements in Pyongyang's relationship with many countries, including the People's Republic of China. So I would think that a visit by President Xi to Pyongyang will occur at some point. Ideally, it will be used as leverage because the North Koreans really want this visit to secure concessions, denuclearization, peace, economics, whatever, economic reform. So that's my bottom line. I know the visit will likely occur at some point. I just hope that we'll get some good concessions from it in return.
Thank you so much. Joe, what do you think of the chance for UN sanctions to be quickly lifted so that both the PRC and South Korea would join hands in providing the DPRK with the assistance? And in your case, I mean, South Koreans would go back to the Kaesong Industrial Park and make a lot of investment to normalize the relationship, if not the mutual trust, between the two Koreas.
Well, there has been mention from the South Korean government that if the United States does lift partial sanctions, that the DPRK would react positively and show steps of denuclearization. But again, this goes back to the chicken and egg game, where the United States wants the DPRK to first show its willingness, whereas the DPRK wants the United States to show that it's willing. So it becomes a very difficult situation for both South Korea and the DPRK as they're trying to continue these inter-Korean projects, but they can't really do so because of sanctions that are in place. But that goes into what's happening between relations of the United States and the DPRK.
Thank you so much. Towards the end of this very interesting brainstorming between the three sides of South Korea, United States, and China, what do you think of the dilemma of China in trying to reach out to the DPRK and provide humanitarian relief since President Kim Jong-un has come over 4 times in less than 1 year? That's very impressive, very, very impressive, amazing actually. How far can China go in assisting the DPRK?
First, I should say China's official position is that China will continue the abiding by the resolutions by the UN Security Council. This is a basic principle for China to engage with all the parties concerned in dealing with the DPRK nuclear issue. And the second, I'm sure China would like to be more active in promoting the engagement, not only between China and DPRK, but also between the United States and DPRK. Actually, China gave 100% support in a previous summit. I mean, in Singapore last June, China gave strong logistics support. So this time, I'm sure China will continue such support, including the airplane if necessary, and also gave some escort by our military for the chairman of KGM. And I think China, of course, maybe change a little bit its policy toward DPRK in the future. For example, gave some humanitarian assistance and gave some culture to culture and people to people exchanges. During our staying in Pyongyang last September, I saw a lot of Chinese at my age. They would like to go to Pyongyang, and they would like to talk about the insensitive cooperation, including the hotel business and some other business. They would like to give their support, not by the officials, by the government. They would like to, by the private sector. They gave such support to the improvement of social life and its economy, and also the international environment for DPRK.
Thank you so much. In fact, many Chinese observers here say quietly that they would love to see the start of a real rapprochement and relaxation of the tensions in the Korean Peninsula, so that the regional economy in Northeast Asia will be rejuvenated, revitalized to the benefit of China. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.